welcome to another video. So today I have my winter wrap-up for 2019 / the beginning of 2020. I feel like it was better for me to do seasonal wrap-ups than monthly wrap-ups because from month to month what I read can vary a lot in quantity and also in just like sometimes it's not worth it. In January I read 2 books, and so there was no point in having a whole wrap-up about 2 books that weren't even very different from each other because they were from the same series. So rather than deal with monthly wrap-ups, I thought that I would just wait until there was a solid season behind me and then I could do seasonal wrap-ups. So this is my winter wrap-up, which covers the months of December 2019, January and February 2020. I have my notepad here with the books that I read, their star ratings, and then some general stats like overall formats and average star rating for this season. And then next to me I have a stack of all the books that I own physically, and then I'll insert pictures for the books that I don't own physically or I don't own at all. Alright, so to get started, the first book that I read in December, or that I finished in December, this one I actually started in November, is Song of the Crimson Flower by Julie C. Dow, I believe is how you say her name. This was a book of the month book for November, it's what this tells me. So yeah, I did start it in November. And it's a pretty short read, but it did take me a bit of a long time to actually finish it. I was reading this for almost a month on and off. And that's just because it wasn't the most engaging. It was not very fast-paced. It had very distant characters. I don't know, I found it hard to connect with this book. This book is about a boy called Bao, I believe, yeah, who professes his love for a nobleman's daughter named Lan, and she rejects him and then later has regrets because they used to be friends. And then in the time that it takes her to kind of reflect on her feelings, Bao actually gets his soul put into a flute, and this story is their journey of how they tried to figure out how to get Bao out of the flute, essentially. And there's a time limit for if he doesn't do it by a certain time, then he's stuck there forever. And it was fine, like the story was fine. I think that this was good for what it is. I think that it was a little too, it was not exciting for me and a little too predictable just because I happen to have read a fair number of East Asian fairy tales in college. I took like 2 courses on it, and so this was not different. It was very much a classic kind of new day version of what were a lot of the kinds of East Asian fairy tales that I was reading. And so it was very much the same, but not in a bad way. Like, I feel like this was an interesting book to read, and I feel like if I hadn't already read several similar kinds of fairy tales and this were my first lens into such a type of fairy tale, that this would be a very good format for that. The second book that I read in December was The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh. This is a book that takes place in the like 1800s, yeah, 1800 New Orleans, and this is a fairy lead edition, so it has some pretty red edges, but it was supposed to be about vampires, and I guess it was kind of about vampires at the very, very end. It follows a girl named Céline Rousseau, who is fleeing Paris after like something went down in her past. She's trying to run from it. She flees Paris, goes to New Orleans, gets taken in by a covenant, and she starts to befriend other people who are fairly wealthy in New Orleans because she's also a dress designer, and so she starts working with someone to design dresses. This person's very wealthy. She takes her into kind of a few different social circles amongst New Orleans like elite, and through that other stuff happens. I don't want to give too much away, but it does become apparent that there's like something else going on, and it's not really a spoiler to say that there are vampires going on and you meet vampire characters because it's kind of what it was sold as being New Orleans with vampires, but the vampires are in hiding for so much of this book that you don't really see them a lot, and you don't really see them in action, and it's very little happens with the plot either. Like, a lot of this book is just spent getting to know Celine and getting, like, very slowly teasing out exactly what her past was and exactly like what her relationship with these new people in New Orleans are going to be. And that was a little disappointing for me. I wanted to see a little more of the vampires at the forefront, and I also feel like it was a little slow. That being said, it wasn't a bad book overall. I gave it 4 stars, so towards the end it did pick up quite well, and I really enjoyed the ending, and I think that I would be interested in what the next book had to offer. I also forgot to mention when talking about Song of the Crimson Flower that I gave that 3 stars. The next book I read in December was also the first book that I read for the Creating & Co. Treat Your Shelves Readathon, and it is The Last Wish by, I don't know how to pronounce his name. I don't even know how to begin to pronounce the first name. The last name looks something like Sapkowski. And so I did read this in preparation for the Netflix series and also to play the video game. My boyfriend and I do want to play the video game sometime, and we want to have read all the books that the video game is based off of before we delve into the video game. But I really wanted to read the first book in December because I hoped that the Netflix series would start from there and I'd be familiar with at least enough to go in and watch that series. It turns out that the Netflix series starts with a bit from this, and then also I believe a bit from the second book, Sword of Destiny, which I haven't read yet. But I say that because I did read this, so I was able to isolate all of the parts that dealt with this, and then the other parts, my boyfriend has read part of Sword of Destiny, and so the parts that I wasn't familiar with from this book, he mentioned most of them having come up in what he had read of Sword of Destiny. So the first season of The Witcher kind of covers those first 2 books. This book is an anthology of short stories meant to just introduce us to Geralt of Rivia and his, like, who he is, really what he does. He is a witcher. Witchers are essentially monster hunters with special powers. They get trained under these brutal conditions to be super warrior fighters and really strong and like resistant to poison and super fast, and they can take certain potions that heighten their abilities even more. And this is all about him. In the first story, he's hunting something called a Striga, which is a creature that was cursed and was born a monster and then hidden away and is essentially terrorizing a castle. Something that I thought was interesting about this book in particular, and a lot of these stories in here, is that they were all very reminiscent of classic fairy tales. And I don't know if that's just a coincidence, if I'm reading too much into it, if I've taken too many English classes about fairy tales. I did major in astrophysics, but my college had a requirement that I take a certain number of courses in other disciplines. And for me, I did like all of my English classes on fairy tales in the Western tradition, fairy tales in the Eastern tradition, fairy tales here and there in different timelines, medieval fairy tales. Basically, that was all I took, every class on fairy tales that I could. And that meant that I recognized so many of the things in here as being reminiscent of those fairy tales. I don't know if that was deliberate, but the first one reminded me a lot of some combination of a story whose name I can't remember. I think it's a Grimm's fairy tale about a haunting in a castle, and Beowulf, just a little bit similar to Beowulf. There's another story that reminded me a lot of like loose Beauty and the Beast retelling. A Hansel and Gretel kind of mention, I think, and I'm forgetting a lot of the details, but that's really what this reminded me of a lot, and I was surprised by that. I also found this book to be very hard to follow sometimes. I was reading it kind of quickly because it was part of a readathon, so that's probably part of it. But there's just a lot. It's like a new world. It's translated, so the Even like the names and some of the places and some of the creatures are really hard to kind of hold in my head because they aren't words that I'm familiar with at all, which is typical for a fantasy world. But then this is a fantasy world that is in translation, and so there are just certain combinations of letters that I'm not used to seeing and not used to pronouncing, and it makes it hard for me to read them and then remember them later on. So yeah, keeping that in order was difficult for me for this book. But it was also a lot of fun, and it really picks up in the last part. You start to see some recurring characters. By the end, you know a lot about Geralt and like why, like how he fights and some of his beliefs about what he does, and it's really good. I liked it. Overall, I gave it 4 stars, and I hope to read the sequel soon, hopefully within the next couple of months. The next book that I read in December is Girls of Paper and Fire by Natasha Nyan. I do not have the physical book for this. I did read it on ebook, so I'll probably put a picture over here about like what the cover looks like. So Girls of Paper and Fire is about a girl who gets taken to be the concubine of a demon king, and along the way befriends other people who are in like training to be concubines to the king. And it was all right. I gave it 4 stars. It was very much, it had an interesting pace. Like, it was never very boring, but it also was never very fast-paced. It had this very constant middling pace. And so I read it, most of it during a plane ride. I was traveling this particular day, so I had a couple of planes, maybe 5 hours on a plane, and I read a lot of it while traveling. And it was a quick read, and it was an interesting read, and I was really interested in the world. And if there was anything that I was disappointed in, it was that we didn't get to see a lot of the world, or at least I didn't feel like the world was very well like developed. Like, there was nothing about it that I could imagine as being incredibly distinct, even though it was told to me that it should be. Like, I didn't get a good sense of the different types of people that are supposed to exist in this world. You have the paper cast, who's like mostly human, and then the farther you get from being less human, the more animalistic features you have, and that's a different cast. And so there's this divide going on between the different classes of people, and that comes up, but not as much as I would have wanted it to. So much of it takes place with this girl in this castle and her training, and then her relationships with the other people. But these are all human people. So even though we see non-human characters in passing, they don't play a huge role in the book, and you don't see a ton of how they interact, really, because so much of it was isolated in this bubble, very much similar to something like The Selection, really, if you've ever read that by Kiera Cass, where you have like this classic setup of a set of girls in a castle being trained to become acceptable for some royal figure. Like, it was that, and didn't stray a ton from that. It did stray a little bit in some interesting ways, but I don't want to give too much away. Overall, I gave it 4 stars. I did think that it was very good. It just didn't change my life. The next book I read in December was A River of Royal Blood by Amanda Joy. This is a book that it's supposed to be a North African inspired fantasy world. Follows the story of 2 sisters who, in this kingdom that they're in, if more than one sister is born, they have to fight to the death, and the one that survives is the one who will inherit the throne and become king, queen. And I thought that that was such an interesting premise. I was very excited to read about that. I was also very excited to read about how this North African fantasy world would be different. The common, mostly European inspired fantasy worlds, you know, like that medieval Europe kind of setting where lots of fantasy tends to take place. I was really interested in seeing how this would be different and what elements of it would be different because it was from somewhere else. And it was all right. I think that I would have wanted, it was very introspective. Like, it's told in first person narration, which means that so much of the book is devoted to the main character, Eva, her thoughts, and kind of how she's thinking about things. And she spends like a ton of time thinking about things and less time doing things and less time with things really happening. And because she's just thinking about things a lot, we don't see it as much of the setting as I would have hoped. I was not as convinced that this took place anywhere other than a regular European medieval fantasy world. Not to say that it doesn't pop up. Things like the dress are different and the kinds of things people wear and how that's described, the names that we get, all of that is very different. But she's not in the world enough for me to see like the different types of shops that happen, the different kinds of settings, just like what's the weather like? What's the plant life like? Like, where is she? I don't know, because she's in her head so much of the time. As far as plot and pacing and things like that, I feel like this was also pretty middling, like Girls of Paper and Fire. It was easy to read fairly quickly. I flew through this in a day. Again, for the readathon, I was reading fairly quickly. And it's picked up a little bit at the end, but not a ton. Like, things were just going along at a fairly constant pace for a lot of the book. And while I don't like a book to drag, I do like it when a book has one or two moments where things are like super like on the edge of your seat, exciting and like engrossing, and I did not really feel that for this book. So I gave it 4 stars. Yeah, 4 stars. Very good, very entertaining, missing just a little bit to really make it good, like amazing. The last book I read in December was Winterwood by Shea Earnshaw. And I gave this I gave it 3 stars. That's generous. Right now I'm kind of feeling like it's a 2. I did not like this book very much at all. So it is technically fantasy. It follows the story of, what's her name? Nora Walker. It follows a girl named Nora Walker who is part of a long line of witches that lives in the woods across the street, or across a lake from a boys' camp. And this book takes place right after a big storm happens, knocks down power. People are isolated for like 1 or 2 weeks, I think, from each other and the world. And one of the boys from the boys' camp, 2 of them actually, go missing. One presumed dead, and the other, no one's like saw his body. People aren't sure that he's dead, but the odds of him having survived that long in this snowstorm are very, very small. So people are also pretty sure that he's dead. And then Nora finds him, but he has no memories, and the 2 of them are kind of trying to figure out what exactly happened that night. I don't know what I didn't like. I was just bored. I was bored for a lot of this book, and it's hard for me to put my finger on exactly why I was bored. I just didn't care about the characters. I found Nora very irritating. It's a very like angsty kind of book. Like, her narration focuses a lot on how she's alone being a witch and she's isolated, but she has to keep on with her like legacy of being a witch alone in these woods. And for a long time, really, it's not even exactly clear what kind of witch we're dealing with. Like, are we talking about like, I don't know. It was just, the magic in this book was also really ambiguous to me, right? Because the people who are in more of a modern world, like living in the camp across the street, they don't really necessarily believe that she's a witch. And it's not clear if the things that she does and the practices that she has, are they real? Do they really do things? Are they just more medicinal? Are they abstract? Like, what kind of magic system is in this book? I don't know. It doesn't make sense. And then she Like, I don't know. I had a hard time connecting with these characters. The guy that she finds, Oliver, he was boring. I didn't like the book. I didn't like it. I'm forgetting a lot of what happens now, but that also means that I didn't like it because I would remember more of what had happened. At the end, you know, the ending was interesting, but far-fetched relative to the type of magic and the type of work that we would have expected, the type of world that we had been led to believe existed in this book for the first like 80% gets flipped on its head for the last 20, and I feel like I didn't appreciate that either. It seemed like it came out of nowhere, and because this is a standalone, I think it's a standalone, it was kind of like, wow, that came out of nowhere. And then there's not like a second book to flesh out the implications. It's just this weird thing that happens at the very end. Honestly, in a way that just felt a little too convenient. So 3 stars. Now we move into my January reads. Both of these are audiobooks that I do not have, so I will put a cover somewhere. The first is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. I did give this book 5 stars. December was kind of a middling month for me for reading. I didn't hate the books that I read. I just also didn't love them. None of them were incredibly exciting for me. And January completely changed that, because in January I started listening to the audiobook for ACOTAR. And it was so good. Like, not, and I hope it's become apparent on my channel that when I say good, I'm not strictly speaking from like any kind of literary or artful kind of good. Like, I don't know that I don't have the authority or the knowledge to talk to you about the characters as people and like the setting and the pacing overall. I can only talk to you about those things relative to how they made me feel as a reader. And it's hard for me to look at books objectively in a way to say like, well, I didn't really like this book, but it was written well. Do you know what I mean? So when I say this was good, I have no idea how to judge it for quality of writing. I do know that the entire time I was listening to it, I was unable to focus or think about anything else. And the entire time that I was listening to it, I was just like, oh my God, what's about to happen? The whole time. It was so exciting. It was just very fun to read. So A Court of Thorns and Roses follows a girl named Feyre. I don't know her last name, but her first name is Feyre. And when we meet her in A Court of Thorns and Roses, she is living in a small cabin with her father and her 2 sisters, and she is doing her best to provide for them. She's a huntress. She goes out and she hunts down food for them to eat, and then sometimes a little extra to sell so that they have money. Her family used to be quite wealthy, but then her father lost all of their money, and then they ended up being impoverished, and she's really the only one doing anything about it. Her father is injured and sad, and that's keeping him from doing a ton of work. Her sisters are very used to the pampered life that they led, and they're just unwilling to learn any new skills and to go out and help provide for the family, so it's all on Feyre. And then Feyre ultimately gets wrapped into this fairy world. So the boundary between where she's living, and I forget the name of the countries involved in, but there's where she's living that has mostly humans, and then this other country that's full of fairies. And this boundary is the result of a great war that humans just very barely won. I think they got like a treaty. They won a treaty where humans are no longer slaves because they were enslaved to the fairies, and now there's this boundary that humans are not allowed to cross under any circumstances, and the fairies bend the rules a little bit about crossing and kind of just messing with humans right on the other side of this boundary. But Feyre does something that means that she needs to go live in that country for a while, and we kind of follow her from there. It is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, so that can give you an idea of this idea where she is a girl that gets taken in trade for like her father in Beauty and the Beast, right? The original story, Belle in the Disney version, or I don't know other names that the main girl goes by in other tellings, but the girl is taken by the Beast in exchange for her father's life because her father is the one who went out and did something. In this story, that actually isn't what happened. Feyre's father had nothing to do with anything except be there. Feyre did actually do everything that she's accused of doing. And yeah, I really like this book. I feel like I really like this book, not just by itself, but especially after reading the second book. So I want to talk about them a little bit more relative to each other. So hold off on that. I gave it 5 stars. The second book I read in January was A Court of Mist and Fury, also by Sarah J. Maas, the second book in the ACOTAR series. This book was so good. It went places that I did not expect it to go. Like, it started a little slow, right? At the very beginning of A Court of Mist and Fury, Feyre is dealing with all of the emotions and the kind of trauma that resulted from the end of the first book and some trials that she had to go through. And it was kind of slow for me. I'm not saying that it wasn't well written or realistic, and kind of like it makes sense that she would have all these feelings. It's just not the kinds of things that I liked reading about, so it was slow for me. But then, as she starts to move past those things really pick up. And the kinds of... I just love it because the first book has you with certain expectations, and in a classic fantasy, like romantic fantasy, expectations like that about like who her friends are and her romantic interests and things, they don't tend to change at all over the course of a book that on the surface is pretty simple. You know what I'm saying? Like, there aren't these hidden like tons of deep messages going on, though there are some interesting themes. Anyway, the second book calls all of that into question. Things and characters that we thought were super important or we thought were really good are now far more morally questionable. Characters that we were set up to believe were bad or evil are now, some of their motives are revealed, and everything is just kind of all over the place in the second book, and you're like, wow, I have no idea what side I'm on for a lot of it, and you're like kind of confused about who's in the right versus who's in the wrong. Or even if you know someone's in the wrong and like that was not cool that they did that, it's still ambiguous about how much you should trust other people in the book. And I really liked it. It was one of my favorite books. I was reading it via audiobook because I wanted to be able to listen to it while doing other things like laundry and doing the dishes and stuff, and then found myself unable to do anything but sit and listen to it because I wanted to hang on to every single word, and I was being just a bit too distracted by everything else that I might have been doing while listening to this audiobook. So I also gave it 5 stars. In February, the first book I read was An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. This book got 4 stars, so it was pretty good. It was pretty interesting, but it didn't meet certain expectations that I had, and not necessarily through any fault of the book itself, just things that I had heard about it led me to believe certain things that didn't end up being as true as I would have hoped. This is a book that takes place in a world that is very much inspired by, I believe it's Rome, Sparta, something like that. It follows the characters Laia and Elias. Laia is, she becomes a slave in the hopes that she will be able to get into a position to figure out what has happened to her brother, who was recently arrested by the government. And Elias is a soldier, a very good soldier, like high ranking, has the potential to go really far in this government because he's very skilled. who actually doesn't want to be a soldier at all. He doesn't like the way the government does things. He doesn't like the things that he's asked to do as a soldier, and he wants out. So he's on the edge of desertion, and the penalty for that is death, right? So he's super serious about getting out. And that's where we find them at the very beginning of this book. And then as we go forward, it's about how they deal with each of their situations, and Elias ultimately gets caught up in this competition that he's following. Laia is trying to uncover where her loyalties are and what really happens to her brother, and it's good. I did expect it to be a fantasy, and though there are some fantasy elements for much of the book, they are not at the forefront of the story. Much of this book is far more political and contemporary. Not contemporary like today, but like everyday, in a Spartan setting kind of contemporary than I would have expected it to be. As we go on through the book and as we learn more about Elias and some of the things that the government is kind of hiding or downplaying, more of the fantasy and magical elements come up. And that was also interesting for me because they came up kind of in the middle, when for much of the book I wasn't expecting them at all. And that just kind of bothers me when a story kind of seems super contemporary and then boom, there's like this one magic thing and I don't get where it's coming from or how it hasn't been affecting the whole rest of the book and like the whole rest of the world, and like what? It kind of feels a little out of nowhere for me. If it's going to be a fantasy book, I want it to be like very richly magical, and if it's going to be contemporary, then it needs to stay in its lane. And that's part of what was unsettling for me about An Ember in the Ashes. It's also why I didn't enjoy Winterwood as much, though I do very much like some of the characters here. And so even though the magic system for me was a little weird and unexpected, overall I did enjoy the book. I gave it 4 stars. The characters I thought were very interesting. I was interested in each of their journeys and like what they were seeking to do, and I wanted them to be successful. So it was very entertaining for the most part. I think it started a little slow, but by the time you get to the very end, like I'm pretty invested, and I will be reading the second book and continuing with the series. The next book I read in February is The Guinevere Deception by Kiersten White. I gave this book 2 stars. 2 stars because I did not like it. So this is a book of the month book from November as well. I picked it up when I got the Song of the Crimson Song of the Crimson Flower. So this follows a girl who goes to Camelot to wed King Arthur in order to protect him. She is a wizard, and she's hoping to use her magic to protect the king. She is coming in pretending to be Princess Guinevere, but we know from the very beginning that that's not really who she is. That is a ploy to get her into this position so that she can protect the king. And also very early on, you know that Arthur is in on this plot as well. They were both under instructions from the wizard Merlin, who has since left Camelot because magic is banned in Camelot, but Merlin is still supposedly doing what he thinks is in Arthur's best interests. And while there, Guinevere is just trying to keep an eye out for anything that she thinks might pose a threat to King Arthur. And then when things seem like suspicious, she starts to investigate. And that's what most of this book is about. Honestly, I didn't like it because it sets you up to believe that who she really is going to be important. And at least by the end of this book, it isn't. Like, whether she's Guinevere or not, that tension doesn't mean anything. I mean, Arthur knows she's not really Guinevere. She doesn't ever tell us who she is as a reader. she doesn't seem for much of the book to really know exactly. So as the book goes on, we learn that she has various memory holes in her memory. And so the truth of things is very ambiguous, and yet that lack of knowledge doesn't have any consequences. Nothing happens as a result of that. It just is. But it's set up to be like, oh, this dark mystery. What is her real name? Where is she from? And then it doesn't matter, and nobody cares, and it doesn't affect the book. And I was bored for so much of it, and I hated the narrator. She was so boring. The main narrator is the girl going by the name Guinevere. I don't know. I mean, it's third person perspective. And that also made it very distancing because she doesn't tell us her name. So unless someone's talking to her or she's going by her name, a lot of the time the narration just says she did this, she did that, she went here, she thought that, she went this way, she went that way. And it just felt like I didn't know the character at all, but it didn't matter that I didn't know her, because by the end of the book, some of the big reveals are about a completely different character. And we still don't know a ton of things about who she is and what she's doing. And I just didn't really get it. Maybe I missed something. I do know of people who really liked this book. I read it as part of, it was the group read for the book lover readathon in the Canadian Co book club. And there were people who really liked it. But it was not for me. I didn't get it. The next book I read in February, I listened to via audiobook, and it was The Selection by Kiera Cass. I think so. If I mess that up, I'll put it somewhere in the editing. But I believe it's The Selection by Kiera Cass. And this is a book that I've read before. So The Selection, I believe, is the first in a 5-book series. And I read the first 2 in high school. It's been anywhere from 6 to 8 years since I've read these books. And so I reread this first one, and I hope to finish the series soon-ish. But the first book is called The Selection, and it follows the story of a girl named America in this post-American world. There was some kind of war that happened, and now there's this new country that's where America once was, and it has a royal family. And the way this country works is that when a girl is born into the royal family, she marries to make political alliances. But when a boy is born into the royal family, he marries one of the common folk in the country in order to, what they say, to build like patriotic sentiments, really, to bring people in the country into the royal family and to like foster good relations, because it gives people the hope that anybody could be in the royal family. And then also within the system, you have a series of castes by number. So there you could be a number 1. Those are people who are super high and super wealthy and have really cozy kind of positions in the country. And then you have your 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s, 6 and 7, I think, are the numbers. I believe America is a 4 or a 5. She is in a family of mostly musicians. She sings, and her parents play instruments or do art or something like that. And it comes up at the very beginning that America has been invited to apply for the selection, which is the competition where anybody in the nation can apply in order to be part of the running to marry the prince. And so she refuses at first to join. She is in a relationship already with a guy named Aspen, who is an even lower caste than she is, and so that automatically puts tension in their relationship, because if you marry into the caste of the man, so if she were to actually be with him long term and marry him, she would be going down in caste ranking. And so he, on the other hand, wants to be able to provide for her in some kind of meaningful way, but he knows that he never could. and she is actually in more of a position to be able to support herself as she is right now than if she were to be with him long term. And so those are the tensions that are happening, but at the end of the day, she doesn't want to leave him, and so she doesn't imagine herself ever falling for the prince. She also has some preconceived notions about what he's like. He's lived this cushy life. She thinks he's going to be stuck up and spoiled and just annoying and irritating, and like, why would she leave what she considers to be a good life with Aspen to do this crazy thing and try to go after this prince that she doesn't even want. However, there are a lot of good things that come with being in this election. So people who are in the last few contestants in this election do get money for their families. If they get far along enough in the competition, their rank is permanently increased to a 2, I believe, which is like second to the highest possible rank they could have. And so if she's successful in this election, even if she doesn't actually win, there are a lot of benefits that could come to her family and to her for the long term if she can just stay long enough in the competition. So she eventually enters, and we spend most of the book watching her try to stay in the running for as long as possible so that she can continue to receive the benefits associated with being in the selection for her family. And I gave this book 3 stars because it was good. Like, it was entertaining. It wasn't amazing. It wasn't even very exciting. Like, not a lot really happens in this first book. It's pretty much just her and some of the relationships she's building with other selection members, her relationship with the prince and how that develops and that kind of thing. But there's not a lot of action. There's not a lot decided. Right, by the end of the book, there still isn't a winner of the selection. We don't learn that in this book. And yeah, I think some of the most interesting thing that I found about this book was how the political climate actually entered the selection, and how there is some unrest in the country, and that does have consequences for people in the selection and for people in the palace, and it does come into the story. And I thought that was really interesting. But overall, it was only okay. I thought the characters were all okay. And I think it was a pretty good setup, hopefully, for things in the future. I'm excited about where the series is going to go, but I wasn't enthralled by this first book. The next book I read in February was Woven in Moonlight by Isabel Ibanez. And this is I got this as a book of the month book, and then what you see here is the Fairy Loot edition of the book, because I also got a copy for the January Fairy Loot book of the month. And I gave this 5 stars. I really, really enjoyed this book. I thought it was just very unique, and it told a very interesting and fun story in this little book. It's a standalone book that I think will have a companion novel set in a different part of the same world, but these particular characters, their whole story is in this book. And it's about a girl named Jimena who is the decoy for a cadenza, and that's like a queen, basically. And for these people called Illustrians. Yeah. And prior to the start of this book, there's this guy named Atak who has come in and led a rebellion against the Illustrians and has kicked them out of the city and has gained power and is now the emperor of what's left. And I forget what his people are called. I don't know if they have a name. They're just not the Illustrians. And also towards the beginning of this book, a messenger comes to where Jimena is living with the current cadenza. Her name is what is her name? It's something like Catalina. Yeah, it's Catalina. So they're living just on the outskirts of the city. They're trying to figure out how they're going to get Catalina back into the palace. But for now, Jimena is her decoy because she's still in danger, because Atak is still out there and no one knows when he might decide to just finish her off so that she won't be a threat anymore. Instead, he kind of takes everyone by surprise by sending a messenger that comes to insist that Catalina go to the palace to marry him. He wants the power of being allied with her and to get the loyalty of her people, to just grow his own nation and just solidify his power. And so they don't really know why he's doing this, but they think that it's a good opportunity to get someone in the palace. And so they send Ximena in Catalina's place, and she goes to a talk and starts to prepare to marry him under the guise of being the cadenza and as a decoy. They hope that she will learn where he hides his weapon. So he has this weapon that's kind of like it's ambiguous to me exactly what it is. It's a piece of jewelry or necklace or bracelet or something they call the Estrella, and it's allowed him to raise and control an army of the dead, and that's how he actually won the first battle. And recently people have been noticing that he doesn't have it anymore, and so the question is, where is it, and can they take it, and can the Illustrians have it, and can they use it to regain control of the kingdom? And so Ximena is infiltrating the palace. She's trying to figure out where this Estrella is, and she's trying to give messages to the cadenza so that hopefully someday they'll be able to regain control. And I really like this book. I thought that the magic in it was very subtle and very unique. And from the very beginning, it's there, right? So it's there and we see it, and it's not unusual how it exists. So lots of different people in this book every now and again will have a special power, and it's pretty small scale, you know, like everyday kinds of things that are just a little different. And I found that very interesting. Ximena's power is that she can weave with moonlight. So she can like take moonlight as it's coming in through like a window or outside or something, and she can turn it into shining thread that she uses to weave tapestries. And no one knows that she has this power, and so it becomes an interesting plot point for how she wants to like deliver messages to the cadenza. And other people have other powers. There's another person that also weaves tapestries, and she does a thing where the tapestries she weaves are actually scenes, like prophetic scenes and things like that. So I thought that was really interesting. And then as we go through the book more, there are different elements to Ximena's power and her weaving that actually come to light that she didn't even know at the beginning of the story. So we follow her trying to find where the Estrella is, and also trying to understand more about her own power and more about these other people. So she's part of the Illustrians. They were in control for a long time, and now she's in this palace that has a lot of people who really don't like the Illustrians, and she's forced to really face why this war happened in the first place and who these people are, not as just an ambiguous enemy that pushed her out of her home, but as real people who had possibly very valid concerns. And she is forced to kind of deal with the fact that they are people who seem perfectly friendly and are also trying to keep her cadenza out of power. And her whole life has been devoted to making sure that Catalina can eventually regain power. And so she has to deal with what are her own beliefs and how can they best be reflected in what she's doing here at the palace. And so I really liked it. It is based the little, oh, and there's a romance in here. I completely forgot. It's like, it's an aside, but it's sweet. I liked it. But the little blurb says that it's based on Bolivian politics, and I thought that was interesting. I can't speak to what it does and does not take from it because I don't know enough about that topic, but if it interests you, that's also something that this book takes inspiration from. Finally, the last book that I read in January is Eight Will Fall by Sarah Herrane. This was a Fairyloot Book of the Month for December, and I gave it three stars. So Eight Will Fall follows this girl named Larkin, who is an empath. Empaths are able to siphon emotions and turn those into outbursts of power. They can use it as a source of energy to do other things, destroy things, blast things, recreate things into other forms, things like that. But she also exists post I think it was some kind of war, but in her country magic is illegal, so she is hiding and she is not able to use any of her powers. However, also in this world, people are starting to disappear. So people are disappearing in rifts that are kind of suddenly appearing in fields, and like people are falling into them and disappearing. And so the queen summons a set of people to go and investigate exactly what is happening. And there are these labyrinths near the kingdom. What are they actually called? Nothing in particular, just like these underground tunnel things. That is where an ancient villain that first caused kind of all of this tension between empaths and non-empaths, where he was imprisoned, and she and a group of people are sent underground to investigate what is happening. Where are these rifts coming from? Where is this power coming from? It's just weird. It seems like his style, and I forget his name. Chiron. This man named Chiron, and it seems like his style of magic, but he was imprisoned so long ago that surely he has to be dead. So what is happening? Like, did people survive under there that are doing this? Did he manage to survive? Is this random? Is there something else happening? What exactly is causing these rifts to happen and these people to die? And so she and other people, 8 total, go under, and they start to investigate. But it's also super deadly. It's pitch black in these tunnels, and there are these weird creatures down there that attack them, and they're just trying to figure it out. And I gave this book 3 stars because honestly, I didn't like it, really. I thought that the premise was very interesting, but when we actually get into those tunnels, it's pretty bleak, and they spend a long time just kind of being picked off, not knowing what to do, and just wandering. And it was both boring and bleak for a long time. And then at the very end, we learned some more stuff, and in the final conclusions, I feel like weren't very clean. Like, at the very end of this book, a lot of stuff happens very quickly. And the more we learn, the more I feel like it was ambiguous what some of these motives were. It didn't make sense to me exactly why some of the characters did things that they did. Because it seems to play into the hands of characters that were supposedly their enemies and also against their own interests, and yet they did it anyway. And that didn't make sense to me. Yeah, and then there's like this loose thread of a romance that I did not even care about because it was just very random. Like, I didn't understand why these 2 characters happened to be together. There didn't seem to be any particular chemistry. They were just together because they saw each other, and then the author told me, oh yeah, they love each other. And then that was the end of the book. So I gave it 3 stars. It was entertaining for like half of the book, and then kind of weird the other half of the book, and not something I would rush to reread. It is a standalone, I believe, so it's also not even something I would want a sequel for. I'm just kind of done with it, but it was interesting for a little while. And that is everything I read this winter. So that's 13 total books, an average star rating of 3.8, 9 physical books, 1 ebook, and 3 audio books. That is my winter in reading. I would love to know what you thought about all of these books in the comments down below. And if you like what you've seen, please be sure to like, comment, and or subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.